first question my friends asked when I told them I'd taken a cleaning job up at the old Carmine place was a universal round of, "Are you serious?" To which my answer was always, yes. Their second question was, "What kind of an idiot goes to work alone in a haunted house?" To which my reply was, "An idiot who needs the money but isn't idiot enough to believe in ghosts." That usually shut them up. To be honest, when I first saw the job advertised, I did, just for a fraction of a second, hesitate. How could I not? For as long as I'd lived in this town, the Carmine place had been the local spook story, the place that kids dared each other to run up to and knock on the door, and a place that even teenagers would base their friend-of-friend horror stories on. These stories, which included everything from eyeless men living under the porch to gaunt ghosts seen in the windows, came in all shapes and flavors, and were for the most part based on recycled snippets from horror films or TV shows that had literally been on a few weeks before. It became a cliche that any spooky story, no matter who the star was or what the details might be, would be somehow attached to the Carmine place, to the extent that one of my friends once told the old urban myth about a hitchhiker and a murderer, only to end it with the villain going back to the Carmine place, which up until that point had not been related to the story in any way. So abundant and so varied were the stories associated with the place that I can honestly say that if they were all true, then the Carmine house would have been the most haunted house in the country, which clearly wasn't the case. Cutting through the torrent of nonsense, however, was the one story that did seem to have at least a grain of truth to it. The story went that old Carmine, the father of the current owner, killed his wife and disposed of the body by having it bricked up inside the chimney like something from an old Edgar Allan Poe tale. The story went that if you passed by the Carmine place at night, you would still hear her wailing or banging on the chimney breast, asking to be let out so that she could seek vengeance on her murderous husband. Tales of the howling coming from the chimney and of banging as Maura tried to escape survived well beyond my generation, and the story was still told by school children right up to the day I took the job, despite there being no evidence for it whatsoever, and the story actually being quite a cruel piece of defamation. I remember telling my mother the story one morning after a few of my friends had wandered past the house on their way back from band practice and swore on everything that was holy that they heard the ghost of Maura Carmine banging against the chimney, screeching to be let out. I can tell you right now that my mother was not impressed. Whatever you and your silly little pals want to say about that house, you can leave the Maura Carmine and chimney ghosts part out. I can tell you for a fact that old Arthur did not kill his wife, nor did he brick her up in the chimney as local gossips like to say. When I insisted that my friends had heard the sounds, that they wouldn't swear if they weren't telling the truth, and that everyone knew what happened to old Maura, my mum lost her temper and snapped at me. "Well then, what everyone knows is wrong," she said flatly, swatting at me with a dishcloth. "I worked as a nurse in the city for 22 years. 2 years of which I spent at the bedside of Maura Carmine before she passed away. It was a horrible, long illness, and making light of it like that is very tasteless. As for old Arthur, he would visit every day and spend hours and hours sitting by her bedside. He was a devoted husband, and it is very mean of you and your friends to spread lies about him. In all honesty, if anyone did haunt that old house, it's unlikely that Arthur or his wife would ever have known because they were never there. Ghosts indeed. I'll tell you something and you listen well. It's the living that harms you in this world, not the dead. Remember that." After that, I never believed any of the BS about Maura and the chimney, ghosts and goblins, no matter how much my friends swore that they'd heard her screaming. So, years later, when Arthur Jr. advertised for a cleaner, I put all the stories to the back of my mind and called him up for an interview. Within a week, I was making my way up there with a bucket full of cleaning products ready to get started. Technically, the job was just for basic cleaning, going around and fixing up the mess that Arthur Jr. left behind him, but it soon became clear that the job was more like a restoration job. In general, the house looked as if it hadn't been cleaned or dusted properly, since Arthur Sr. had passed away 15 years earlier. Not to mention the fact that, ghosts or not, the mansion-like home certainly fit the description of a haunted house. It had a dusty old library, an abandoned nursery that hadn't been touched in decades, and more cobwebs than the spider exhibit at the city zoo. There were big, Gothic-looking candelabras and chandeliers, old wooden furniture pieces, and of course an open fire with the famous chimney breast extending out above it, all of which were covered over with years upon years worth of dust and filth. When I mentioned how this could potentially be a much bigger job to Junior, he just shrugged. He said that if I wanted to fix the place up, getting it cleaned out and organized, and back to how it used to be as a much longer project, then he'd be happy to pay me. When I said that this was a much bigger job that was probably worth a much bigger salary, maybe double or more what he was paying me for the basic cleaning, he shrugged again. "Tell me what you think is fair for the job and I'll pay it. You're good at what you do," he said, before adding with an odd, awkward smile, "Plus, I like having you around the place. Sometimes a house needs a feminine touch, you know?" I wasn't sure how to respond to this second statement, but the first one I heard loud and clear. I agreed to take on the cleaning job and set out a plan. I proposed to go through every room in the house one at a time, clearing out what wasn't needed and deep cleaning what remained. It was a big task, but by the second week, I was making good headway, until the knocking started. I remember clearly that it was a Thursday night. I had come to the house later than usual that day because I'd had to go to school for my kids' parent consultation meeting. The result was that I arrived after dark and predictably got my first hint that something wasn't quite right about the house. It started in what Junior referred to as the drawing room, the same room where the ominous-looking chimney stretched up to the ceiling. I was taking books down from the shelves, snapping the titles on my phone to look at them later on eBay and see how much they were worth, with a view to telling Junior and seeing if he wanted to get rid of any, when I heard a sudden, dull thump. For a second, I thought perhaps I had dropped one of the books, or that the broom had fallen over, but then the sound came again, louder this time, and regular. Bang, bang, bang. I froze. Though I knew damn well that the stories about Maura were nonsense, I still did not like being alone in this creepy old house with strange noises going on around me. For a second, I waited to see if the sound would come again. It did. Bang, bang, bang. 3 loud knocks. Slow, hard, and deliberate. This was no problem with the plumbing or the sound of the wind. Someone was making that noise. Someone or something. When the sound came again, accompanied by a low, distant wailing, I decided I wanted out of there. At the time, I was standing by the bookshelf up at the top end of the room. At the other end of the room, the end that I currently had my back to, the chimney breast was waiting. As the sound came again, I imagined it emanating out from that chimney, saw in my mind's eye the rotted skeletal hand rapping against the brickwork, the lipless mouth of some ancient cadaver, bricked up inside, calling and wailing to be let out. I shuddered at the thought of turning around, at the idea of looking back toward that fireplace, at the prospect of seeing, even for an instant, what might be making that sound, begging, pleading, even from beyond the grave to be let out and released. Just at that moment, however, a realization came to me. Turning on my heel to face the chimney, no longer scared of the rotting, knocking hand, I marched boldly toward it and listened. Sure enough, the sound was coming from there, rattling up from somewhere inside and spewing out, as if the fireplace itself were a gigantic mouth. As I listened, straining my ears to distinguish one sound from another, my mother's words rang in my head. It's the living that harms you, not the dead. Reaching up toward the chimney, I took down the axe that had been placed there as decoration, and aiming downward toward the floorboards, raised the blade above my head and swung it, shattering the boards to pieces. In total, 4 women were pulled out of Arthur Carmine's cellar, or rather, 4 were pulled out alive. It seemed he'd been keeping people down there for the better part of 20 years. When his mother got sick and he had the house to himself, he had decided that he had enough privacy to indulge his little fantasies, and enough space to keep some pets. As it turned out, the stories about the chimney were true. Not about Maura being bricked up in there, but about the noises, the banging and the screams to be let out and released. The sounds of desperation had echoed up from the cellar and resonated through the chimney so that they could be heard at ground level. The sounds of women trying desperately to get out. In the end, it turned out there was banging at the Carmine place, but not because it was haunted, and whilst there were never any ghosts up there, it had been home to a monster.